moderator, asking a couple questions to Lauri about his case and his extradition victory. And then Grace North here, the head of the Jeremy Hammond Defense Committee, is going to talk about some of the specifics of that ruling. It really got pretty detailed about U.S. prisons and the issues. And Barrett Brown, who's been in U.S. prisons, is going to talk about efforts at reform and how just impossibly bureaucratic and terrible it is to try to get the most basic grievances redressed. So the Courage Foundation supports whistleblowers, but we also support truth tellers more broadly, people hackers like Jeremy Hammond, Lauri Love, who make important truths public for the betterment of the public debate. So we support these individuals, but we advocate for them in a way that attempts to better the situation for whistleblowers and journalistic sources more broadly. And probably our most exciting victory to date came earlier this year. We successfully defeated the U.S. attempt to extradite Lauri Love to the United States. So Lauri Love, I'm so glad you could not be with us today. Can you talk about the question of jurisdiction? So you were investigated in the UK for a crime that allegedly happened in the US, and the US wanted to extradite you in 3 different jurisdictions. So can you talk about why that was?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you may be being over generous to the UK law enforcement by saying I was investigated. I think the Department of Justice just said, this is the guy we want you to inconvenience, and they did. But the problem was I wasn't charged under UK law, which would ordinarily be the thing that happens if you're accused of criminal activity. So after about a year and a half after I was arrested, I was re-arrested by the extradition unit of the Met Police. And the reason for that was that 3 concurrent jurisdictions in the US very much requested my presence so they could lock me up for 99 years, which is completely unparalleled. I don't think even Osama bin Laden or Pablo Escobar or anyone like that has been attempted to be extradited 3 times at the same time. Luckily, they weren't successful, and the issue here is why does the USA, why does the Southern District of New York, for instance, have jurisdiction to prosecute crimes allegedly committed by a person in the United Kingdom? And more importantly, why does only the US get to exercise this extraterritorial jurisdiction? Why do they believe that their laws apply to the entire world? And why have they arrogated to themselves the position of enforcers of the internet? This is troubling. So where we are now is the jurisdiction is back to where it should be in the UK, and we're waiting to see if the prosecutors here will take up the case.
So you're facing 99 years as potential maximum in the U.S. What are you facing in the U.K.? What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, so there's a very interesting discrepancy in the sentencing regimen here in the UK to the US. Ironically, the reason they wanted to kidnap me and lock me up for the rest of my life was for alleged participation in a protest after the tragic death of Aaron Swartz. And Aaron Swartz was hounded to suicide exactly because there was so much leeway for prosecutors to pile on charges in order to put duress on a defendant to bargain away their constitutional right to a fair trial through plea bargaining. Whereas in the US, I would be facing, as you say, up to 99 years, and it would be incredibly onerous on me to take the deal. Here in the UK, the maximum sentence for the alleged offending would be 36 months, of which you'd expect to spend half a year in custody. So that's quite a big difference. That's like a 50 times ratio, and something is a bit skew if one country can treat things so aggressively relative to another, and then have the gall to come in and step on their justice system and attempt to take it over.
We at Courage were excited about the ruling in your extradition case, not only because it kept you over there, but also because they made use of the forum bar and they criticized U.S. prisons. But that was like the first test case of the forum bar, right? I mean, it was instated after Gary McKinnon's case, but can you talk a little bit about the history of that and why that was so important?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing to state really is that the extradition treaty between the USA and the UK is exceptional, would be the nice way of putting it. Perverse is the most accurate way of putting it, in that the USA doesn't have to provide a single solitary shred of evidence to extradite a person. And I want you to bear this in mind because there could be a very big extradition case coming up that's going to have ramifications for journalism and democracy more generally, and they will not have to prove a single thing in that process because it's all by assumption. So the forum bar was introduced after in early 2000s, the USA attempted to extradite another young man with Asperger's syndrome called Gary McKinnon, who had been looking around allegedly on some Pentagon and NASA computers, not to commit crime, not to aid a foreign adversary, not for personal profit or gain, but out of curiosity and civic-mindedness. They attempted to extradite him. There was a 10-year battle. He lost legally at every stage, and it was only because of a massive public campaign that pressure was brought to bear on the Home Secretary at the time, Theresa May, who refused to sign his extradition. After that happened, they changed the law to do two things, a double-edged sword. They took away the discretion of the Home Secretary to consider human rights implications of extradition, which again, I want you to bear in mind, considering what might be happening in the near future. The person who signs the order that means somebody is rendered from the UK to the USA is not allowed to consider whether their human rights will be breached. But as a fig leaf, they offered the forum bar, which was that if it's in the interest of justice to prosecute domestically rather than in the requesting country, then it should be done so. And nobody was successfully able to argue that until this case. So we have established that at least it's a workable provision in law. And hopefully what it will do is change the calculus of whether prosecutors try to go for extradition or try to do the sensible and reasonable thing, which is prosecute under the laws of the jurisdiction in which the crime is committed.
I know some British Muslims who have faced extradition have not been so fortunate in avoiding extradition, but now we have this precedent of the forum bar. Do you think this victory is going to be able to be applied more broadly and especially to help the more vulnerable?
I do hope so. It's important for me to acknowledge and to make explicit to everyone else that I've been afforded some privileges in my case, in that my skin is the right color, or at least when it's not red, it's not brown, and therefore I've had a lot more opportunity, and I've been given a better ride in the press, and I think the courts extended more sympathy because I do not adhere to religions that are associated wrongly with extremism, and because I'm white and relatively capable of putting on a middle class accent. There have been a lot of people who have not had such a fair ride through the UK extradition system. Good organisation to look to learn more about this is Cage in the UK. And what I'm hoping is that there is a precedent set by this case whereby if the USA attempts to request the extradition of a person who has not committed a crime physically in that country, then there will be a presumption that this should not be allowed. And the other important thing about our ruling was it was based partially on my health conditions, but it was also heavily informed by the absolutely abhorrent conditions in US detention facilities and the Bureau of Prisons, but also the county jail system, where there is absolutely no accommodation for neurodiverse people with autism. There is no effective healthcare provision for people with depression, people who may be vulnerable to suicidality, and there is extensive and disgusting use of solitary confinement. And we see this especially with political dissidents. Jeremy Hammond, for instance, and Barrett Brown on the panel here, Matt DeHart, have all been subject to solitary confinement, and this has been described by qualified professionals as being tantamount to torture. So there is a massive amount of work to be done to reform justice and detention in the US or abolish these systems, and hopefully the ruling that we got, because it shed light on how terrible the conditions are, will help people that are trying to drive that reform.
All right, I want you to jump back into the conversation later and let me know if you'd like to, but that sounds like a good time to hear from Grace talk about the specifics of the ruling and what it could mean for U.S. prisons.
Hi. So as he said, solitary is used extensively in the U.S. prison system, and one of the ways that it is used is supposedly to sort of deter inmates from committing suicide. In Suicide Watch, you are put alone in a cell, you are stripped of all your clothes, of all your possessions, you are put in a paper smock, and you are sat there for the entire day and monitored via camera. This obviously presents a problem when you're dealing with someone who is already mentally ill. As he said, solitary confinement has been ruled by every major human rights group in the world as a form of torture. So when you're dealing with somebody that has pre-existing mental health conditions and you put them in a situation like that, you're obviously not improving the situation at all. You're actually making it worse. So in the actual ruling, the judge that handed down the ruling said that social isolation was known to precipitate psychotic episodes, including psychotic depression and increase in suicidal ideas, a severe deterioration in clinical depression, a likely recurrence of psychotic ideas, a severe deterioration in his physical health should be anticipated. Suicidal risk would increase to very high in consequence, exacerbating rather than reducing the risk of suicide. So you're really at a point, especially with Suicide Watch, where the solution to the problem is actually exacerbating the problem. Also in the ruling, the judge talked about the appalling conditions for people who are mentally ill in the prison system. He specifically focused on two of the prisons that Lauri likely would have been transferred to, which are MDC, which is in Brooklyn, and MCC, which is in Manhattan. And in it, the judge said that in reality, only 2 or 3 psychologists were available in each institution for direct inmate health care. Positions were often kept vacant because of cost, and the ratio of inmates in need of care for significant psychological difficulties to staff psychiatrists was about 100 to 130 to 1. That meant that for every 100 to 130 prisoners, there was 1 doctor. And that those doctors did not just deal with inmate mental health, they had other tasks as well. He said at MDC, MCC, the number of inmates likely to have significant psychiatric difficulties yielded a caseload of 500 inmates out of 2,461. If all were seen weekly, the workload would be 12 inmates per hour, meaning you have 5 minutes with a psychologist. 2 of the items of primary note were first a report of a federal magistrate describing the conditions for female inmates at MDC as unconscionable because of the absence of sunlight, fresh air conditioning in the heat, outdoor exercise, and receiving very poor food and medical treatment. There was a report of a visit in June 2016 by the National Association of Women Judges to MDC that made the same points. It noted that the BOP then said it could not find physicians willing to work in a New York prison and that conditions had been, quote, unconscionable for 3 years. So really what this says about the overall conditions of American prisons is that they are horrendous. Medical care, even physical medical care, is just non-existent. For example, a simple request. Jeremy needed glasses. Glasses seems simple enough. And glasses, it seems like a little thing, but when your lifelines in prison are getting mail and reading books, glasses are super important. He had to wait 3 years to get glasses. Another case that I worked on, the case of Stanley Cohen, he told me a story. He was in pretty much the lowest of low security camp you could possibly be in, the type of camp where they regularly let prisoners go home for the weekend, kind of low security. An inmate complained for 4 years about stomach pains that progressively got worse and worse and worse. He went to the prison doctors. The prison doctors dismissed him for 4 years. They said, you're faking. You just want to get out of work. It's not that bad. You're fine. Here are some Tums. Go back to work. One day he was working on the prison grounds. He was on a ladder fixing something or painting something, and he fell off the ladder, and he hurt himself to the point where he actually needed to go to an outside hospital for x-rays and treatment. And while he was at the hospital, they found out that this inmate had stage 4 stomach cancer, and that had basically been ignored for the past 4 years. And this inmate then applied for compassionate release to be released to his family so he could go home and spend what little time he had left with his family. And the prison denied it. So, I mean, all of this, I mean, when you look at it in the larger picture, if physical health care is this hard to access, mental health care is even harder to access. And prisoners suffer. They suffer immensely. And the fact that the extradition was blocked largely on humanitarian grounds, I mean, really speaks to just the abysmal state of the U.S. prison system. And, you know, we have all these talks about, well, we need to reform it, we need to reform it. Reform is not enough. It is 100% not enough. Not enough is being done. The system as it is cannot be reformed. Reform is sort of like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic at this point. So
stay over there, Lauri.
please don't come here.
So Barrett has been in U.S. prisons, and he's been thrown in solitary, and he's had his books taken away, and he can talk a little bit about efforts to redress grievances.
Yes, so back in, prior to 1996, it was, the courts were somewhat accessible to inmates, both in state and federal institutions. 1996, Congress passed the Prison Litigation Reform Act, which put the process by which an inmate in the U.S. who wants to challenge any terms of his confinement, wants to challenge any due process violation, you know, whether he's being held in his shoe illegally for years and years, or is being beaten by guards frequently, or any number of other things, you know, running down to little mundane things that, you know, like with the glasses, sound mundane, but are often very significant. They first have to conduct what's called the administrative remedy process. This process is under the control of the prisons themselves. To do so and to conduct this process and thus be able to access the courts at all, you first have to fill out what's called a BP-8. This is in the federal system. Then you wait about a week or more, depending on them, to get a response back. And then you have to fill out a BP-9, which goes to the upper staff of that administration at the prison you're in. Then you'll wait a couple months, and you'll get that back. And if you still do not feel that your grievance has been remedied, and it usually has not, you can send a BP-11, I believe it's called, to the regional BOP offices. And there's a number of months you'll have to wait after that. And then if you don't like that, you can send it to the national BOP office. And if you don't like that, then you can go to court, and that's usually about 2 or 3 years later. Even if you have gone through that process, there is no repercussions for any prison to interfere with that process, as in if they claim falsely that you missed a deadline or whatever, you can point that out. And I did that not just in my filings after that. I also did it in a column I wrote from prison for The Intercept, in which I documented the entire process over about 2 years. They knew that I was writing this column, but they were confident enough in the ethical shortcomings of the American people and of the Congress that it wouldn't matter what I wrote. So I was thus luckily able to get a pretty good, provide a very good sort of example, you know, of what it's like, not just for me, but for prisoners all over the country. And so they interfere at every level of the process, and they can, and even if they get caught, even if finally a judge acknowledges they did, nothing will happen to them. So they do it, and that is fundamentally the chief problem that prisoners in the U.S. face, that they do not really have due process. Even to a lesser extent than we on the outside have due process. They have even less. And without that those measures in place, it is difficult for them, without resorting to violence, to address their grievances. And so that's why we have riots, demonstrations, that sort of thing. It's one of the reasons. It's one of the legitimate reasons why we have them. I spent about 6 months altogether in the SHU, which is Special Housing Unit, which is, it's a 23-hour-a-day lockdown, usually 24-hour-a-day lockdown in a small cell. I actually stayed at one in Seagoville, Texas, that used to be a internment center for German Americans during World War II, and that was an interesting SHU right there. It's one of the more interesting ones I was ever in. And so, across the board, whatever, and I explained this, I tried to explain it to the BBC when me and your father, Larry, went on there to talk about your case, tried to explain that it is important that the U.S. prison system is incapable of housing inmates in anything approaching a civilized way. It is important that the DOJ itself is acknowledged universally to be broken. There's no one who will defend the argument outside the DOJ that the DOJ works. It does in some ways. I mean, just like the FBI does successfully do some things, but it's also, they're both overridden, just absolutely just wrought through with institutional deterioration. I'm not sure how else to refer to it. But anyway, so there is a lot that needs to be done to reform these things. Some of these methods involve inmates themselves. Some stuff that we can do on the outside. I've mentioned in my talk yesterday the pursuance system, which briefly is a framework for mass collaboration. We'll be having one of the entities that we create for this pursuance framework will be a prison reform deal using the media. But beyond that, it's important to explain to people in England, for instance, and to France, and here in America, that they're used to a certain kind of system of justice that is not perfect by any means, but which is, in the end, a system of justice in some way. And they tend to think that they tend to assume that the U.S. being a Western country, that derives, in the case of England, that derives directly from their jurisprudential traditions, that we would be similar. And it's just simply not so. And that's why it's important. What Courage is doing is so important. That's why what Lauri Love's case was so important. And it's why those who continue to take risks to do things that are right, even knowing what we know now about how these things work and what you're going to be subjected to, watching Lauri's case, seeing how far they will go to capture someone in England for allegedly conducting things, crimes on the level of things the DOJ and U.S. government do every single day. We have to respect them all the more for continuing to work after having seen what happened to those of us who got caught.
I think it's worth mentioning that the extradition victory was the second big victory in Lauri's more than 4-year long battle. First, the NCA, the British police, seized like 30 of his digital devices, only gave back 25 of them because they were still trying to decrypt the other ones. And they tried to get Lauri to hand over his passwords, and he refused. Could you talk a bit about that and how you won that? Oh, we can't hear you. Wait, we can't hear you.
Okay, if I unmute the microphone. So I was in the strange position of being arrested in 2013 by essentially a UPS delivery guy. Somebody dressed up as a UPS delivery guy and 11 of his friends, masquerading as police officers, and then not charged with any crimes, and kept on bail for about 9 months. And released from bail, and at that point I began inquiring, as one would, as to where my things were and if I could have my things back. And for people who don't know, there are procedures for arrest, search and seizure, and with digital devices the standard operating procedure is to image them and return the hardware, because not returning the hardware when somebody hasn't been adjudicated as having been guilty of any crime is a interference with their goods and business. So this wasn't done. Rather than having my things returned, I was offered a piece of paper that said words to the effect that if I didn't give them some passwords and E-phrase cryptographic information, I could be locked up for 2 years for not complying with this Section 49 legal order. So I didn't feel compelled. Instead, I kind of made them a counter offer of under what conditions I would entertain this request. Conditions such as, they have to prove that there is encrypted information on the device, which is non-trivial. They would have to prove that I'm capable of decrypting that information, which is non-trivial. And most importantly for me, they would have to prove that they can coerce me into working for law enforcement whose objective in this context is to lock me up, which is very, very problematic. So I said no to this order. What they should have done is taken me to court to try and apply that 2 years stick incentive. They didn't. They elected not to do so, and I continued to ask for my property back. And when polite negotiations were going nowhere, I invoked a piece of civil law called the Police Property Act from 1897, and it just says that they're not investigating you if they don't intend to charge you, then you get your stuff back. It's a very simple administrative remedy. And when I tried to take it to court, the solicitor for the National Crime Agency very sneakily suggested that the court set a direction that the case could not proceed unless I give them these passwords, which again is very troubling. So just to zoom out a bit, people turn up at your house in disguise to get in there, they steal your stuff, you're not charged with any crime, you threaten to be put in prison for not helping them read some things that they think they might be able to read, then your property is kept from you for years, and in order even to have a hearing to have it returned, you've got to pony up this supposed information to help them fathom what's on the devices. Luckily, we had this case. They were successful the first time they set this direction because it was in front of three not particularly professional lay magistrates who didn't see a problem with it. And I dropped the case, picked it up again after the extradition, and transferred it to the same court where the extradition hearing was held. And in that court, the judge found that they could not preemptively require a person to undermine their own security in order to exercise the right to property, which is very fundamental. In a way, more important than me getting extradited or not is, do we have the right to own ones and zeros? Do we have the right to have data? And the only way to actually possess data is to securely possess it, because if it's not secure, it's not yours. It's the next person who picks up your laptop when you go to the toilet, or the next person who breaks into it, or whatever. So if there is a presumption against having a right to property in itself, if the government cannot arbitrarily inspect the contents of that data, it's going to be fundamentally challenging to journalism, but to civic society in itself, because unless you can have information that is yours and under your control, you are under totalitarianism. It might be a soft glove, it might be an iron fist, but unless you have agency and autonomy over your information, in an age where information is the currency and the leading means of exercising power in the world, we're fucked. And I'd rather we would not be fucked. And so my advice to everyone listening and attending here is assert your right to use cryptography, assert your right to have data secure, and assert your right to say no if somebody else wants to have access to your things, unless they can prove through a functioning court system, such as you guys do not have, and we do not have. But in a hypothetical world, in a functioning legal system, they might be able to prove the need to open up cryptography. But the presumption should be that your data is yours, and we want a small victory in that, but it's very much an ongoing battle.
I think Grace had something to add about prison grievances.
Yeah, I had something real quick to add about prison grievances. But beside them being this sort of labyrinthian process that you have to go through. If you file too many, the guards will retaliate against you. Prison workers will retaliate against you. That can take various forms, and just generally messing with you, calling you out on things that would normally let slide. But it is a very real danger that if you speak out too much, you will receive negative pushback from prison guards and prison administration for that.
And Barrett, you felt like you were personally targeted, right? You were retaliated against in prison.
Yeah, everyone did. I was thrown in a couple times on investigations. One time about an hour after I did a radio interview over the phone, which you're permitted to do technically. Then another time, what was it? Oh yes, for 2 weeks. Another time when I was doing a phone interview with Alex Winter, who was doing a documentary with me at the time. And a assistant warden demanded I meet with him in private about an administrative remedy grievance I had filed against him, and I told him I would not meet with him in private about that, that we had to follow procedure. And so there's a good recording that Alex got over the phone of me being pulled away from the phone by the prison guards. And he used that for his the documentary called Relatively Free that he did with Laura Poitras later on.
A couple of people have come up to me and said, like, free Barrett Brown, what's going on? I thought he was already out, but you still have more than $800,000 in fines, restitution?
Yeah, the judge ordered me to pay $800,000 to Stratfor, which is a Austin-based intelligence contractor that does illegal black ops works for other corporations here in the U.S. and for repressive regimes abroad. And so the order itself obviously was widely criticized because there was really no basis to it. I'm not a hacker. The hack of Stratfor was known about by the FBI. I didn't know about it until after they did. I could not have stopped it if I wanted to, and I did not want to, of course. But anyway, so yeah, I owe a bunch of money, and they've used that to send subpoenas to The Intercept, which I used to write for, and to my publisher, Macmillan, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and to my agency, my literary agency. Demanding all communications, demanding all information regarding payments. About a year ago, they didn't send an order to my publisher not to pay me any more of my advance, which was my sole source of income, until further notice, and that further notice turned out to be quite further indeed. Just now started being able to get income again legally after a year, a couple weeks ago.
So hope we made clear why it's a really good thing that Lauri's still over there. But we have a little time for questions, if anybody has any for Lauri or Barrett or for Grace or anybody. I can relay things to Lauri if you can hear.
Hey, so I have a question. I particularly like to hear Barrett's thought on this, but all of you for sure. Just in looking at the prison system and the legal system generally, I think when we're trying to create an analysis of how we've gotten this level of unaccountability and the mass kind of physical infrastructure that lets these kind of things happen, I think we have to, if we want to look for like opportunities to create collaboration or opportunities to actually make meaningful change, we have to look at the drug war and what it's done in terms of building prisons and in terms of, it's created so much demand for incarceration that everything else has had to give, and that includes all of our fundamental rights. So when we're creating these coalitions, I think that has to be part of our analysis, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I mean, that's why the drug war is one of the opposition to the drug war is one of the several tenets we've sort of put as ideological markers that that we want you to agree to if you come into the pursuance framework when it launches a few months from now. Obviously, the drug war has been used to erode every single one of our amendments in the Bill of Rights. Every single one has been affected by that adversely. There are things that police would have no viable way of doing if there was not the constant possibility that anyone in this room may be violating the law right now by possessing something. That's obviously changed the entire society and has had a very deleterious effect on our governments, our institutions. So yes, the drug war is something that has to be opposed along with these issues that the drug war has helped to exacerbate.
Question for Lauri. don't know what your lawyers have said about the possibility of you traveling in the future. Will another extradition attempt be tried if you go to France or Ireland or something else?
Oop, we need your mic.
Is the question about whether I can travel?
Yes,
More or less, yes.
Would an extradition case be requested if you tried to go to France, for example?
Yeah, so this is exactly the problem. Despite having nominally defeated the US Department of Justice as regards my extradition from the UK, there is nothing under international law stopping them from inconveniencing me, even in Scotland. So, I could go up and visit my family in Glasgow, and because it's a separate court system, they could put the process over again. And France, Germany, definitely couldn't go to Southeast Asia because they have a track record of literally kidnapping people from airports, extraordinary rendition is still a thing that happens. So I'm in the very strange position now of having to, in a way, cheerlead, if not facilitate, my own prosecution under UK law, just so that I can get into the same position as the LulzSec defendants who now have been convicted and can travel, to some extent around the world. They can't visit the USA, not that I especially want to until the current regime falls, which you all could help speed up if you want. But yeah, so my prison is now England and Wales. What I'm going to be doing is Her Majesty, the Queen, owes me several £1,000 travel expenses. So when I get that back from her, I'm going to get a van and I'm going to tour England and Wales, launching a campaign of boycott, divestment and sanctions against the USA. This is something that started been ongoing for some time with respect to Israel because they are an oppressive apartheid state, and unfortunately the USA is trying to catch up and children are being caged. You are in the early to fruition stages of fascism, and I've got nothing against the people that are there. You're kind of trapped by the condition you're in, but people need to push back against the way the USA is conducting itself, and so I'm going to be promoting that quite heavily in the future because I can't really do much outside of the country.
So piggybacking a little off of that, yes, America is in the early stages to sort of middle stages of fascism, and we should not allow that. We here right now need to be pushing back against fascism where and when we see it, including this conference right here this weekend. The tech community is a community that is beautiful, is a community that is diverse. We need to be embracing that. We should make fascists fucking afraid to show their faces in public.
Let me add, please, there are a number of federal contractors at Hope. One's name is Tom Ryan. He's well-known. He has a long history. That's aside from the usual, FBI agents. We have, a guy. We have people here who are either Nazis or are highly sympathetic to Nazis, and not all of them are just visitors.
So, fuck fascism.
I think we've all signed the statement, no fascists at Hope, and
Yes.
Courage has added its name to that.
Can I add something to this?
Yep.
One of the things that the people in this crowd especially need to realise, if they haven't, and I think there has been a breakout of consciousness with it, is that the things that will enable fascism in the 21st century will not necessarily be jackboots and physical oppression out in the streets, but it's going to be subtle things like algorithms that affect your ability to interface with reality through your newsfeed and your freedom of association through social networks and the way that people are silently herded into virtual pens by the way social media is currently run. It's a hegemony of unaccountable private interests. But also on an even smaller level, like by 1,000 cuts, everyone who is writing a line of code and is not sure that they're able to exercise their right to have a conscience about how that code is being used and whether it will form a system that takes away people's rights and consolidates power to unpleasant people who would like to persecute minorities. This is going to be a massive problem because power is now algorithms, power is now code, power is how data moves from one place to another. And you can see with IC that people can end up on the business end of horrific detention because of a combination of algorithms or pattern matching or filters that suddenly come together and pluck them away from their family. And this is incredibly pernicious, and we need to all be thinking about what the hell have we unleashed with this Pandora's box of technology and how we can stop it from being that fucking thing on the Raiders of the Lost Ark that eviscerates everyone, because we are in danger of having this turnkey totalitarian internet, and this is the last fork in the road to stand up and say, no, we want the open internet that empowers and brings people up and gives opportunity and doesn't increase the power and control of people that are already bringing about horrific things in the world.
This was actually brought up this morning in a talk by the Lucy Parsons Lab. They were talking about how Amazon Recognition was being now sold and marketed to police departments to incorporate facial recognition into body cams and things like that, which again is obviously very troubling, but doesn't just stop at police departments. It could go to border control, ICE, and then you then get, of course, all these databases of just people who are innocent, but are people of color, people who are further marginalized because they're the people that are mostly at the receiving end of police oppression.
I wanted to bring up a concept of in the past, how we would deal with a lot of these corrupt legal systems, governments that stole from us, did not have proper due process. The traditional method of dealing with this was to emigrate. You just got the fuck out of a place that had a rotten legal system or, rotten law, rotten institutions. And it seems like, now that we've kind of expanded to the borders, since the early 1900s, we don't have that physical ability anymore to emigrate. I've been kind of enchanted with this concept of digital immigration, of emigrating into, a digital space where, our rights, our property, for, the extent possible, we can immigrate into that space. Are anybody on the panel kind of sensitive to these issues, aware of, ways in which we can do that? Just interested in hearing your thoughts on kind of a potential new wave of digital immigration. Thanks.
Lauri, if you didn't hear that, it was about digital immigration when we don't have the ability to physically immigrate.
Yeah. So one problem is so some of us, I guess a lot of the people here at the conference or listening, came to the internet voluntarily. It was a thing. They were early adopters, and they were part of it when it was an idealistic place where there was a possibility of transcending some of the ludicrousness of physical-based reality. Unfortunately, for most people, the internet collided into them, and suddenly they find themselves part of digital spaces. They've never had the opportunity to have an understanding that those spaces need to come with rights and protections. And we saw the death this year of the warfare of the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, and it's worth rereading that and having a think about how we're actually going to assert control for ourselves as communities over digital spaces, because at the moment we exist in a neo-feudal situation. You might have a niche interest and you use a subreddit, and unfortunately it's up to a few people that you do not have a reasonable power relationship with to decide how your space is policed and controlled. And so the ability to emigrate digitally to exist in different spaces can only exist if we can actually assert some control and some representation, and to have some notion of civil rights as they apply in online spaces. And as regards replacing systems that are fundamentally broken, such as, unfortunately, the courts in the US, the detention system, and arguably, I would say, the system of democratic franchise, because of the toxic influence of money and other things more recently. We need to actually build for ourselves, forge for ourselves effective replacements where our power is built in. And I would defer to people like Barrett right now, who is building the Pursuance Project as a model for how people can organize and collaborate together in a way that is not vulnerable to co-option and control by censors and oppressors.
You want to talk about that?
Okay, yes. So specifically about the, I didn't hear all of that, the project we're doing for the prison reform?
Just the ability of pursuance to allow people to
Okay.
securely.
Right. So Pursuance is a framework for mass civic collaboration. It's something that we've refined. It's an idea we've refined over years and years that I've, during which time I obviously had a lot of interesting experience. You got to observe a lot of interesting things involving online collaboration vis-a-vis Anonymous, Tunisian Revolution, crowdsourced research, which my group Project PM did. It will enable participants starting with a hand-picked population. We've got about 2,000 individuals and organizations that have signed up to participate thus far. We'll probably have a lot more in the next 6 months. Those people who strive to a basic open society philosophy will be brought in. They will then bring on other participants and so on and so forth. At a rate of about 5 a month, that will be the limit. Anyone in the Pursuance system will be able to create an entity called a Pursuance, which is sort of a living organizational chart, something that kind of draws upon what we now know about the best ways in which to provide a space for collaboration. So every individual will be entirely in consent-based, sort of informed consent-based entities in which they have signed on, understanding every step of the way who they're working with, and being in control of that in ways that aren't always possible in some of these amorphous organizations and movements. It'll be something that can grow, that can nonetheless remain refined as it grows, even refined further. It's something that will allow existing institutions like NGOs to create presences by which to better take advantage of their existing supporters and constituents in ways that go beyond fundraising and signing petitions. It will allow just all the individual people out there who are tired of the way things are going and who have lost some of their faith, at least, in institutions that we used to rely on, to come into somewhere where they will have an opportunity to work, just to stop these things. And that's very important. It's important that they be provided the ability to do that securely. We're living proof of that. And so this is an open-ended, encrypted, open-source system. You can read more about it. You can see it on GitHub or our pursuanceproject.org website.
Another question?
Too tall for me. I have a question for you about the grievance process. And so kind of a background about why I'm asking is concerning the private prisons. We had a friend who was in a core civic facility, and he was placed into solitary confinement, and we were able to compel the sheriff to do a welfare check.
Right. Oh,
which is, it was a lot of, like, hundreds of people who compelled them. And so they did go out, and when they came out, they gave a very unsatisfactory response that if you can think of Walmart being a private entity, that we don't have the right to go and ask them about the internal running of their corporation. And so they told us essentially that core civic, being where they detain our citizens in a prison, that we didn't have the right to know what was happening with them because they were private.
Right.
And so my question is the grievance process the same in that, being that there is very little oversight whatsoever in the private prison system?
I know less about the private prisons than I do the federal ones. I have been in a couple of what we call federal overflow facilities that are run semi-privately by counties in Texas, and those are the worst ones. Like, I've never, anyway, I don't need to go into that. But I don't know. The grievance process is supposed to be applicable, however, to private prisons. As in, I mean, inmates in private prisons are still supposed to be able to seek redress in the courts. And I believe that they have expanded the 1996 bill, and I may be wrong about this, but I believe they've expanded it in some way to also cover private prisons. In fact, I have seen some stuff on that process existing there. Again, but I would consider it to be, it's probably less reliable even than the ones we're used to dealing with. If you would also please, if you could, my email address is on my Twitter account. Could you please send me information about this incident with the sheriff and the welfare check?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank
And, this also applies to, I don't know if you know what happened in Tennessee with another core civic facility where they actually had a scabies outbreak and they were putting anybody who
Happens a lot.
tried to tell anybody they had scabies into solitary confinement.
Yes.
They finally released word into the media, but by then the scabies had gone all the way up to judges and all of the administrative people up until then because prisoners come in contact with those people. And so it was like the same thing where they didn't have this system of grievance where they could go and redress that. And it wasn't until judges got it that anyone
Yeah, okay, yeah,
cared.
I'm glad they did.
So.
Same.
But yeah, it's just it's a universal problem. It's every single problem is covered by this. That's why the administrative remedy process is such an important thing to focus on. We talk about prison reform. Thank you.
All right, if there are no more questions, thank you all for coming out, and appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Courage has a table in the vendor table section, so please stop by and say hi.
See you guys.
Thanks.